encouraged by what you see tonight. So again, welcome to our live Zoom webinar for Epic Archaeology, where tonight we're going to be talking about the task of archaeology in Christian apologetics. So again, thank you for joining with us tonight, and we are going to be we're going to go ahead and get started now. So what I'd like to do is to start us off with, I'm actually going to do my share screen. So hang with me here just a second, and then I'm going to share some slides with you guys, and hopefully you can see this. Hang on. There we go. Let me get out of this. All right, there we go. That's the one I want. All right. So I'm going to begin with a quote from Robert Price. And by the way, for those of you who don't know who Robert Price is, Bob Price, he is a scholar known as a Jesus mythicist. So Bob Price doesn't believe Jesus existed, or he is very highly skeptical if Jesus ever existed. But this is what Bob Price said about Christ in his book, Christ is a Fiction, in 1997. He said, "It is quite likely, though certainly by no means definitively provable," which that itself ought to tell you something, "that the central figure of the Gospels is not based on any historical individual. Put simply, not only is the theological Christ of faith a synthetic construct of theologians, a symbolic Uncle Sam figure," he says, "but if you could travel through time like Superboy and you went back to the first century Nazareth, you would not find a Jesus living there." Now, that's what Bob Price says about Jesus. Richard Carrier, who is another Jesus skeptic, says this. He says, "The Gospels generally afford us no evidence for discerning a historical Jesus, and that most of what Christians, or that is early Christians, wrote were lies," he says. "We should approach everything they wrote with distrust." Elsewhere, Carrier noted that the New Testament book of Acts, quote, "reliability for demonstrating the historicity of Jesus is essentially non-existent," end quote. So two quotations from two well-known scholars in the literature, although I don't know if they necessarily represent mainline scholarship. I'm pretty sure they do not. But this is one end of the spectrum where scholars distrust the Gospels. And so the question is, how do we answer this? And what is the task of archaeology in answering this? Of course, many of you know, most of you know, the passage in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, which is basically the Apostle Peter says that we are always be ready to give an answer or a defense for the reason, to everyone who asks you for a reason, the hope that's within you, but do this with gentleness and respect. So that is what we hope to accomplish tonight, is to actually do this with gentleness and respect. So let me stop there. So this actually starts us with the question of, how do we know the past? Actually, let me back up. I'm going to see where we are. Yeah. So I'll begin with that slide, with how do we know the past? Because if you think about it, the central claim of the Christian faith, the central core claim of the Christian faith is the resurrection. Christians believe, all Christians around the world, no matter where you come from, no matter where you are, no matter where you're watching this, if you are in South America, or if you are in Europe, or Europe in Asia, no matter where you are, all Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead bodily, physically rose from the dead. And so this happened, this event, the resurrection, happened 2,000 years ago. And so the question is, it's a historical question. And this brings us to the question of, how do we know the past? How do we know the past? Because that's a fundamental question. And it's not just an important question for the study of Jesus' life and the New Testament. It's also an important question for even our modern world. This, of course, is a painting of a very famous battle that happened on June the 18th, 1815, known as the Battle of Waterloo. It happened in Belgium, and it was the defeat of a very famous emperor of France by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. So the question is, this is just a first example of how do we know the past? We know the past through historians, what we call primary sources. So I want to give you 3 primary sources for how we know the past. Number one, we know the past through eyewitnesses, someone who actually saw the event. So today we are living over, just about 200 years since the Battle of Waterloo. And so how do we know we can trust that? Well, there were people who lived through the Battle of Waterloo. There were soldiers who actually wrote diaries, and so they're eyewitnesses of that. And they left behind something that we call historical records. Now, all of these historical records, some of them have very good historical value, some of them have not so great historical value, but I would consider these all of them historical records of some sort. So we would call these, any kind of record that's left behind of an event, we would call historical records. And then the third thing that we have is archaeological evidence. So once again, we know the past through primary sources. So we have eyewitnesses, we have historical records, and we have archaeological evidence. So let me give you an example. And tonight we're going to be talking about the value and the task of archaeology in Christian apologetics. That's the theme of our webinar tonight. And so we're going to really dig into that a little bit deeper in just a moment. But let me show you how these three actually work together. With the historical records, what we'd really like to have historians, if they could, we really want early attestation. We want historical documents that were written within the period of the eyewitnesses, and preferably we would love to have a historical record that was written by an eyewitness. But oftentimes we don't have that. Sometimes we do. But we want early attestation, and we want multiple attestation. So not only do we want someone who's writing about a firsthand account, we would also like other historical documents to basically say the same thing. And so, and we'll talk about one more in just a moment, but with historical records, what we want is early attestation, and we would like to have multiple attestation. So again, to review, how do we know the past? Where does historical knowledge come from? And this is, again, not just true for the Battle of Belgium or whatever historical event you want to talk about. We know the past through primary sources. Once again, the three primary sources for history are eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains. Those three work together. So let me give you an example of how these three work together. Two examples, one from my own personal history. My grandfather, his name was Bruce. He actually told stories as a kid growing up. He would tell stories about being in the war. And when I was actually a kid, I listened to the stories and I thought they were really interesting, but I didn't really connect the dots about which war it was until I was grown. And I began to connect the dots. My grandfather, you can see a picture of him there. He's in his 20s. He fought in D-Day. My grandfather was in World War II. He fought on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious military invasion in the history of warfare. I mean, that's no joke. You can look that up. Don't take my word for it. D-Day, Operation Overlord. Maybe you saw the movie Saving Private Ryan, and you remember the scene where Tom Hanks' character is in the boat. My grandfather actually drove one of those boats on D-Day. So my grandfather, he is an eyewitness to the event of D-Day. Now, he's no longer alive, and what we have left are the two other sources. So you remember the three sources. We have eyewitnesses, we have historical records, and we have archaeological evidence. So my grandfather is now passed on, and now we've got his the things that he's left behind, such as this photograph. And this photograph was actually in a book that my grandmother gave me, that my grandfather actually had with him in the Navy in England, and he would record where he was when he was in England, and he actually has an inscription of where he was on D-Day. So hang on one second, let me stop there. Yep, so there we go. So these are some of the photographs that he took. This is from the U.S. Naval War College. This is a picture of him on the left. He's standing up on the top left-hand side, some of the soldiers. But in this book, these are primary sources. These are historical records of my grandfather's experiences in World War II. And there's a photograph on the bottom left screen of my grandfather in his boat. Well, actually, it's not him. He's taking the picture, but that's some of his buddies. And then the next picture, really interestingly, is a German sailor from the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, that they captured. This is a German torpedo boat, and my grandfather actually happened to be on the patrol where they caught this German torpedo boat, and they captured it, and he snapped a picture of this German sailor. So here is a photograph of my grandfather's writing. So this would be the historical record. The photographs and my grandfather's writing are the historical record of the event of D-Day. And on this inscription here that you see in the line, you can see it in his own handwriting. It says, I'm going to read it to you just in case you can't read it. It says, June 5th, 2 a.m. till June 6th, 6:33 a.m., 28 of the most miserable hours I ever spent. We made the trip from Portland, England to France Beach in our 50-foot barges. Sea was rough as could be. And then he has encircled, wet and cold, entire trip, 1944. So if you know that date, June 6th, 1944, that is the D-Day date. And my grandfather, again, this is a historical record. So we want eyewitnesses, we want historical records, and we want archaeological evidence. So you can actually go, these photographs are actually from the library, the United States Library of Congress, that you can actually access online. And these are actual photographs from war correspondence on D-Day. So this is what it would have looked like when my grandfather, when he was driving his boat, when he let the guys out, this is what he would have seen on Omaha Beach. He was actually third wave, so his guys got out. As later, when the Allies began to land, there was a larger force that began to accumulate on the beaches of Normandy. And this photograph was taken by a aerial reconnaissance balloon that was shown to be, again, the largest amphibious naval battle in history. So the third thing in our historical sources is archaeological evidence. So when you go to France today on the beaches of Normandy, what you can find is concrete reinforced German machine gun positions. These are, for lack of a better term, these are archaeological remains. These are the remains, even though it happened 70 years ago, these are archaeological remains that we can go and investigate. And we can actually date the stones. You can do tests on the stones. You can compare the stones with the historical records, with the Allies' maps that they had, even with the German maps. The Germans also had maps as well. So not only do we have the German positions, but we also have thousands upon thousands of dead Allied soldiers on the beaches of Normandy. So something happened here significantly 70 years ago, and this is a great illustration of how the three primary sources actually work together. We have the eyewitnesses, we have the historical records, and we have the archaeological evidence, all three working together. Now, let me give you one more example before we move to the Bible. And this is an example that many people are aware of. They know about this story. It's the sinking of the RMS Titanic, which was sunk on April the 14th, 1912. Now, it's hard to believe that that is over 100 years ago now. But that happened, and there are a few World War II veterans that are, they're in their probably 90s or close to 100, I'm not sure, but they're slowly dwindling away. And there's going to come a time in which there are no more survivors of World War II, soldiers and people who experienced that. But with the Titanic, there are no longer any survivors who actually survived the Titanic. And so what we have, again, are eyewitness accounts, historical records, and we've got the archaeological remains. But on this example, I want to give you an example, a lady by the name of Eva Hart. Now, Eva Hart, there she is on the bottom left. You can see a photograph of her. She is now deceased. She's passed on. But when she boarded the Titanic with her mom and dad, she was actually 7 years old. And there she is with her mom and dad there on the top left screen, 7 years old. And the interesting thing about this example about the three sources is that when the Titanic sank, of course, there were almost 2,000, not quite 2,000 people, about I think 1,500 people or so that actually survived the sinking of the Titanic. There were many that perished, about 1,500 that perished as well, that went down with the ship. It was a huge disaster. But what's curious about the example of the Titanic is we've got an eyewitness account. Eva Hart was one of them. She said that when the ship sank, as she was with her mom, her dad actually passed away, He did not make it on the lifeboat, but as the ship was going down, she noted that the ship just broke in half as it began to sink. So if you ever saw the movie, The Titanic, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, they did portray that in the movie. But before the movie was made and before the Titanic was discovered, really, no one really knew if the ship had broken in half. All we had were eyewitness accounts of Eva Hart and other survivors of the Titanic. But the example here is that there were other survivors, other eyewitnesses who actually said that the ship just sank. They actually said that it didn't break in half, it just sank. So here's an instance in which we have eyewitness accounts that seem to conflict with one another. One person says they broke in half, the ship broke in half, and the other person says the ship just sank. So what is the only way, what is the only method that we could use to determine if the ship actually sank? Well, we could actually go to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean if we could discover the wreck of the Titanic, and we could ascertain if in fact the ship had broken in half. And guess what? That actually happened. Back in the 80s, Dr. Robert Ballard, who is with the National Geographic, and he's also an oceanographer and ocean explorer, he actually, using remote ROV robots as well as side scan sonar that he was using to help find lost nuclear submarines, he actually discovered the wreck of the Titanic, and it was just remarkable. And there is a photograph of the bow of the ship resting on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And lo and behold, when Robert Ballard found the Titanic, guess what? It had broken in half. In fact, the bow section of the ship was almost a mile from the stern section. So this is an example of how the archaeology, in this case, nautical archaeology, marine archaeology, in which they're going in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and they're confirming that what one of the eyewitnesses said, or several of the eyewitnesses said, was actually true. So here's where I want to insert something about archaeology and what it can do, and I want you to know this. Archaeology, even though people may or may not like this characterization, archaeology can, in fact, it can affirm certain statements that people make in history. It can do that, and it does it all the time. One person says this, another person says that, and archaeology can actually affirm that. So here's a case in which the archaeology, in this case, the finding of the Titanic actually confirms what one of the eyewitnesses actually said, in this case, Eva Hart. So how do we know the past? Again, we know it through primary sources: eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. Again, to show you this chart here, that's how it works. With historical records, again, what we would like to have is early attestation, and we would like to have multiple attestation. So in other words, we want historical sources to actually be close to the event, whether it's World War II, someone seeing World War II, like my grandfather, or in the case of Eva Hart, with the sinking of the Titanic. We want early attestation, and we want multiple attestations. So not only do we want one person saying it, we'd like to have other historical sources saying it as well, but there's another one, and there's enemy attestation. So in the case of World War II, we could actually go to the German sources as well, Nazi Germany, and they were not friends of the Allies, and we can look at their records, and their records will actually correspond and match to what the Allies say as well. So we have early attestation, multiple attestation, and enemy attestation, and these are really good indicators that we have a very firm historical event. But again, that's not the whole thing. History is complex, and there's a lot that's going on, and we'll sort of explain it as we get into it. Then we have archaeological evidence. So let's look at the historical evidence for the New Testament reliability. This chart is fairly accurate. The only thing that's a little bit inaccurate about this is on the top hand line where it says Homer's Iliad. That actually, the number of manuscripts now for Homer's Iliad actually is somewhere around 1700. So we have quite a bit of manuscript evidence for Homer's Iliad. but there is a huge gap between when it was written and when the earliest copy that we have. With Plato, with Homer, it's about 500 years. With Plato, about 1,200 years. With Aristotle, again, when he lived, and the first documents that we have it's 1,400 years. With Caesar, the Gallic Wars, we have 1,000 years time span between when it was written and the first copies that we have. Now, again, there's always exceptions. There's always manuscripts that are discovered, and they're continually being updated all the time. But generally speaking, this is a fairly accurate chart. The Greek historian Herodotus, in his book, The Histories, first written in about 484 to 425 BC. The earliest copy that we have is about 100 AD, making a time span of about 600 years. Livy, who wrote the History of Rome, there's about a 400-year time span in between that. Whereas with the New Testament, what we have is it was written during the time of the eyewitnesses, during the time in which people could have seen Jesus rise from the dead. We have the earliest copy. Portions are written between 150 AD. So within the second century AD, we have entire books by into the second century, and the entire New Testament extant manuscripts by about 300 AD. So we have a time span of about 29 to 100 years in between the event in which it was recorded and the copies, the manuscript copies that we actually have. In fact, there are now well over 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. In fact, this is a quote here from New Testament scholar Dan Wallace, who says that it would be safe to say that we have altogether about 20,000 handwritten manuscripts of the New Testament in various languages, including Greek. Furthermore, he says if someone were to destroy all those manuscripts, we would not be left without a witness, because the church fathers wrote commentaries on the New Testament, and to date, more than 1 million quotations of the New Testament fathers have been recorded. And then he says, if all other sources for our knowledge of the New Testament were destroyed, the patristic quotations would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament, wrote Metzger and Ehrman. He's quoting there Bart Ehrman and Bruce Metzger. This is from Dan Wallace in his book, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament, published in 2011. The number of New Testament Greek manuscripts as it stands today is 5,800. Non-Greek New Testament manuscripts, about 18,000, bringing the total number of New Testament manuscripts to about 23,900 manuscripts. The earliest manuscript that was thought that 2 years ago or so, that there may have been a first century Mark fragment. We now know that it's actually second century, still old, it's still the oldest Mark fragment, but currently the record for the oldest manuscript is something called the John Rylands fragment, also known as P52, located in the John Rylands University Library in Manchester, England, and very possibly discovered in Egypt at Oxyrhynchus. And what's cool about this manuscript is it actually contains it contains a section of John chapter 18, the Gospel of John chapter 18, verses 31 and 32. And then on the reverse side, so there's the recto, the front, and then the back side, the verso, we've got John 18, 37 and 38. And this is the episode in which Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate, and they're having this conversation about what is truth. Remember, Jesus said, all those who are on the side of truth, listen to me, and then Pilate asked the rhetorical question. We don't really know how Pilate asked that question, but he asked Jesus, what is truth? And so this is a very early fragment from the Gospel of John. Dan Wallace says, ours is not a lack of evidence, but an embarrassment of riches in biblical manuscripts. So again, we're talking about the three primary sources. We're talking about eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. And we really haven't gotten the archaeological evidence yet. We're going to get to that here in just a second. So with primary sources, not only do we want an early source, but we want multiple attestation. And what we'd really like to have, not only multiple attestation, we would like to have enemy attestation. And in this case, I want to bring to mind or recall to your attention a Roman historian by the name of Flavius Josephus, also known as Flava Flav. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. I know that was corny. But he was a first century Jewish Roman historian that was a contemporary of the period of the New Testament. In fact, Josephus actually witnessed the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And he's writing about events that happened in the first century. So he's there, he's a court historian to the Emperor Vespasian. He was an eyewitness to the first Jewish war against Rome. And his two main books are The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, written primarily for a Roman audience. He also wrote about the life and practices of Jews in the first century. So again, this is a historical record that's not part of the New Testament, but yet what we can learn from Josephus is essentially the same core truths that we learn from the New Testament. Now, again, Josephus, I'm not saying Josephus is a believer. He's not, but he's just merely writing about some of the facts that were available to anyone doing any kind of careful history of that period in that area. And so Josephus actually wrote about Christ and his followers. So from the Antiquities of the Jews, he says this. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a wise man, for he was a one who wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. He appeared to be alive again the third day, as the divine prophets foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him." This is a summary here from Dr. Gary Habermas at Liberty University in his book, The Historical Jesus, of certain things that we can learn about Jesus just from Josephus alone. And there are 10 of them. Number one, Jesus was known as a wise and virtuous man. Number two, Jesus had many disciples, both Jews and Gentiles. Number three, Pilate condemned Jesus to die, and he was executed by crucifixion. Number five, his disciples reported that he rose from the dead. Number six, he appeared to them the third day after his crucifixion. Now again, Josephus is saying this. These were things that were going around in the first century, so much so that a Roman historian recorded them. And then it says in number 7, it says, I almost said verse 7. It says in number 7, his disciples continued to proclaim his teaching, even after they were told not to, of course. Number 8, he was perhaps predicted by the Old Testament prophets. So it kind of looks like maybe Josephus is hedging his bets there. His brother's name was James, and he was called Messiah by some, or Anointed One by some. So not only is Josephus writing about Jesus, also another Roman historian by the name of Tacitus, who again is not necessarily a friend of Christians, yet he's writing about the early Christians and some of the facts surrounding Jesus at this time. Tacitus wrote later during the reign of Nero, and he records certain things about Christians that happened under the reign of Nero in Rome. He says that, number one, Christians were named after their founder, Christus in Latin. He was put to death by the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate. Number 3, this was during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, which we know about historically very much. His death ended the superstition for a short time, and then it broke out again. So there was this, it was like they could not contain this belief that Jesus was risen. And this belief of these early Christians that Jesus was risen was just kept spreading, and they could not contain it. Number 6, it broke out again in Judea, where the teaching had its origin. Number 7, his followers carried his doctrine to Rome, which is where Tacitus is writing from. And we know, of course, in the book of Romans that Paul wrote to the Church of Rome, even at that time. In fact, one little side note about this, earlier we were talking about the importance of historical sources, and we wanted early sources. We wanted sources that were written very close to the events in which they're writing about. And again, I wouldn't say this is an airtight argument, but I will say this is very curious, and I think it's certainly significant that none of the New Testament writers, in fact, it's sort of generally believed by New Testament scholars that the earliest gospel is Mark. I know there's difference of opinion on this, and I'm not here to argue that, but let's just say for argument's sake that the earliest, some of the scholars believe the earliest gospel is Mark, and that the later epistles of Paul were written after the Gospels. But in nowhere in the New Testament is it recorded the destruction of the tabernacle in Jerusalem. The reason why this is important is because this would have been a major thing. And we know historically and archaeologically, we know this, in fact, nobody disagrees that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Even liberal scholars believe that. So if there's no mention of the destruction of the temple, that means that the entire New Testament was written before 70 AD. So that means that before 70 AD, Christ, and where Paul's writing to the Christian churches of Rome, the message that Jesus was risen was already in Rome. So his followers carried his doctrine to Rome, and then under the reign of Nero, when a great fire destroyed a large part of the city during the reign of Nero, the emperor placed the blame on Christians who lived there. Christians were hated because of their abominations. These Christians were arrested after pleading guilty. Many were convicted of hatred for mankind. And number 12, they were mocked. They were tortured, being nailed to crosses. And because of this, the people had compassion on the Christians. So Tacitus therefore concludes that such punishments were not for the public good, but were rather simply to the glut of one man's cruelty, that is Nero. So there are certain historical facts. Again, we haven't even gotten to the archaeology yet, which is really what I want us to get to. And there are certain historical facts about Christ from Tacitus that we can learn just on the historical sources alone. The New Testament also mentions several Caesars and government officials by name and in a particular order. And I mentioned a couple of those already: Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Governor Cyrenius, Pontius Pilate, Felix, Festus, Sergius, Paulus, and Gallio. Commenting on this, G.F. McClure states, quote, "Classical history attests that these persons existed at the time specified, and that they bore the offices here assigned to them, and that the actions ascribed to them are either exactly such as they are performed, or at least are in perfect keeping with their known characters. Furthermore, the order in which the New Testament places these officials is also the same order in which Tacitus places them as well." Now, I would like to, not now, but later, encourage you to go to our website. When you get time, go to epicarchaeology.org, and you can actually click on the blog, and there's a really very interesting blog article that I wrote on Tacitus and the lost legions of Varus, V-A-R-U-S. Varus was a Roman general, and there were 3 Roman legions that were lost in ancient Germany, known as Germania. And Tacitus writes about this. And the reason why, I'm giving you kind of the crux of the article, the crux of the reasoning of the article, which really dovetails into what we're talking about tonight, and that is the function of archaeology. What is the task of archaeology? What can it actually do? Once again, archaeology can actually affirm what historical sources say, or what they claim to say, what they claim to say happened. In this case, with Tacitus, Tacitus writes about this event known as the lost legions of Varus, in which Rome, ancient Rome, in fact, it was the largest defeat in Roman military history. 3 entire Roman legions wiped out, killed. There were only a few survivors, and then they were captured and taken as slaves. And Tacitus writes about this. And then later, 2,000 years later, historians research this, and they go and they actually find the bones of the Roman soldiers in this forest called the Teutoburg Forest. So the archaeology actually affirms what Tacitus says about the lost legions of Varus. But there's a connection between what Tacitus says about Varus and what he also says about Jesus. If he's right about, he can write accurate history about Roman affairs, he can also record accurate facts about the life of Christ. So the archaeology affirms what he says about the Roman general Varus and the 3 lost legions of Rome, but it can also affirm what he says about Jesus. And so I want to encourage you to check that out. Go to epicarchaeology.org. click on blog, and you have to scroll down and look for it. But it's called Tacitus and the Lost Legions of Varus. It's pretty cool, I think. Now we're getting to archaeology. What is archaeology? And many of you probably already know what archaeology is, but for our sake tonight, for our webinar, I want us to be on the same page, and I want us to understand archaeology. I want you to understand what it is, and then we're going to talk about biblical archaeology and what that is, and if there is in fact such a thing called biblical archaeology. Some people would say that that's actually not a great term, but of course everyone knows this guy. He is our hero, Indiana Jones, of course, and that is not quite what archaeology is. Many people think archaeology is grabbing the gold idol, you know, running from the bad guys, and you know, honestly, there may be a little bit of truth in that, but that is not how archaeology is practiced today. But I want to give you here a kind of a definition of what archaeology is, and also make a distinction between how archaeologists study the past versus how historians study the past. So what is archaeology? Archaeology is a scientific investigation of the past using material remains from past human cultures. This includes the recovery, the cataloging, the analyzing, and the interpretation of artifacts. So archaeologists study the past, but they do it primarily through artifacts. And I actually have an artifact here with me, a piece of pottery. You can see it right there. So if you're an archaeologist, you're going to study the past by using artifacts, by using pottery, by using buildings, and you investigate the past and by recovering it, cataloging it, analyzing it. So let's be clear about that. It is a study of the past primarily by using material remains and artifacts that humans have left behind. Anything that has been made or modified by a human would be considered an artifact. Pottery is an artifact. A stone tool could be an artifact. So anything that a human has left behind is an artifact. An archaeologist, again, strictly speaking, archaeologists study the past by looking at artifacts. History, on the other hand, is an investigation. In fact, the word history comes from the Greek word historia, which literally means investigation. Many people may not know that. Maybe you didn't know that. I think people today think that history is just myth or made up. But in the classical sense of the term was actually coined, I believe, by Herodotus in his book, The Histories, or The Investigations. And so history is a study of the past by looking at primarily written records or text. So anything that's been written. So historians reconstruct the past based on written records, whereas archaeologists study the past by looking at artifacts. So a written record could be anything such as a manuscript written on papyrus, written on a animal hide, written on a piece of pottery known as ostraca, engraved tablets, temple walls, stelae, which are these giant slabs of stone with carving on them. The Rosetta Stone is an example of historical record, palace walls. So anything that has writing on it, historians are interested in those things. So as you can tell, there's a little bit of crossover between archaeology and history, because sometimes archaeologists discover artifacts that have writing on them. So in that case, then there is a crossover between archaeology and history. So I hope everyone's clear about that there is a distinction between archaeology and history. And as it's practiced today, depending on where you are, if you're in the ancient Near East, or if you were in the Americas, or if you're in Europe, archaeology is practiced in different ways, and in its understanding of its connection to historical text. That's really the crux of the issue with biblical archaeology, is what is the relationship between the archaeology, the material artifacts, and actually what we read about in the text. And so what is the task of archaeology? So again, we looked at this, we looked at the past, we looked at archaeology, and so what is the relationship between archaeology and apologetics? And so we're going to look at that. So here's how I would put it. Archaeology can do three things. Archaeology can affirm the historical basis of the text. If you'll remember our example from the Titanic, if you will remember our example from my grandfather who fought in World War II, there were eyewitness accounts, there were historical records, And the archaeology, when you go to Normandy, you can find the remains of German positions. You can still find remains of tanks in the sand, in the beach. They're all rusted up. But the archaeology actually affirms what the historical sources say. So it acts as a confirmation. So archaeology acts as a forensic science. It can actually study historical events by looking at the material artifactual remains of a certain event. Number two, archaeology can also illuminate the cultural background of the Bible. And this is one of the coolest things about archaeology. It can give us insight into the world of the biblical writers. Now, obviously, the Bible was written, the New Testament, 2,000 years ago, and the Old Testament, 3,000 years ago, according to conservative scholars, including myself, who believe that Moses, of course, wrote most of the Pentateuch. He didn't record his own death, obviously. But so the Bible is very, very old. It's an old document, and it's written about in a particular time, in a particular place. So archaeology can give us insights into cultures such as ancient Egypt, ancient Assyria, ancient Babylon. It can tell us what life was like. What did people wear? What kind of jewelry did they wear? What kind of food did they eat? So archaeology can give us illumination into the cultural background of the Bible. And then the third thing archaeology can do is archaeology can clarify certain passages in the text itself. So again, affirm, illuminate, and clarify certain passages in the Bible. So this brings us to the function of archaeology, the task of archaeology. The task of archaeology is really just to do archaeology. Let me go back before I show you the slide. The task of archaeology and archaeologists is just to do good science. I would not say on this podcast or on this webinar that archaeology is meant, in fact, most archaeologists today working in the Near East, that is not their primary goal. Their primary goal is not to necessarily set out to prove the Bible. Their goal is to do good science, and all good archaeologists do good science, as they should. And as myself, I'm actually an associate with Associates of Biblical Research, and I've taken part in excavations in Israel, in the West Bank, and I'm also involved in another project in Turkey. And so our goal as archaeologists is to actually conduct good science. We want to ask the hard questions, and if we want to follow the evidence wherever it leads. So the task of archaeology is to do good science and to try to reconstruct the past as best we can by using all of the relevant scientific material that we can, all the technology that we can, using drone technology, using things like LiDAR, which is a very high-tech way of measuring three-dimensional space, by using satellite imagery. We want to use good science, and we want to try to find out as much as we can about the past. We also want to use pottery, the analysis of pottery, known as ceramic typology, and we want to do good archaeology. So that is the task of archaeology. But what is the task of archaeology in apologetics? What can it do? Once again, archaeology, even though archaeologists today working in the Near East are not necessarily trying to prove the Bible, but it in fact can. It can actually show, and I will say prove, it can affirm what the biblical writers actually say. In fact, I would say this, that since archaeology began over 100 years ago, archaeology is a fairly young science. It's only been around for a little over 100 years, and scientifically, it's been around for about 100 years, getting its start with a British archaeologist by the name of Flinders Petrie, who first used scientific excavation and pottery analysis to study the sites in Israel, in particular a site called Tel El Hesi in Israel. He actually learned this from an archaeologist, a German archaeologist working in Turkey that you may or may not know. So some of you who will know who he is, Heinrich Schliemann, who was digging at ancient Troy, believed it was the ancient site of Troy, very famous in the book of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so it's a site called Hisarlik in Turkey, and it's a mound that in Israel would be called a tel. In Turkey, they're called a hoyuk. So he's using pottery to analyze the biblical record. And so archaeology can actually affirm the historical base of the Bible. So when archaeology got its start, let me give you an example of what I'm trying to say here. I've tried to think about the easiest way to explain this, but But imagine across the lands of the Bible, down in Egypt, all the way through Israel and the Levant, up into Syria and Lebanon, going all the way over into the Fertile Crescent, into Iran and Iraq, into Turkey as well. Because archaeology is a young science, a lot of the things that we know today were unknown 100 years ago. The only place that they were mentioned was the Bible. And the first example that really came out of the ground, not the first example, but one of the first examples of how archaeology actually affirms or can affirm the Bible, was the discovery of the Hittites. In the early 20th century, a German archaeologist by the name of Hugo Winkler actually discovered the entire Hittite civilization. In fact, you can read about this here on our website. Again, go to blog and click on the link of blog, and then go to Discovery of the Hittites, which again, we document how the discovery of the Hittites actually affirmed what the biblical record actually said. Now, the Bible had written about the Hittites for at least 3,000 years, but archaeology discovered the Hittites in the early 20th century. So you see, archaeology is catching up to what the Bible has already said. And again, Hugo Winkler did not set out to prove the Bible, but in discovering the Hittites, in fact, when he first found the Hittite civilization, the site, he didn't even know what it was. And it wasn't until later, until someone made the connection, oh, these are the Hittites mentioned in the Old Testament. And this is just the first of several examples. Another example would be another team of German archaeologists working in ancient Babylon. I'm thinking of Robert Koldewey, who actually discovered, and not discovered, but he actually began excavating first systematically the site of Babylon. And of course, you know, Babylon is mentioned in the Bible in King Nebuchadnezzar. And this was discovered in the late 1800s, early 20th century by Robert Koldewey and other teams of German archaeologists. So there's example after example of how, as archaeologists begin to uncover things throughout the Near East, what they've done is they begin to affirm what the biblical writers have said. Now, again, when I say prove, I don't mean prove that you have to believe it, but what I'm saying is that in an affirming way, archaeology can actually affirm what the biblical record says. So to sort of round us out tonight, and then I'm going to open up for Q&A here, the New Testament, of course, is situated firmly in the period of the Roman, the Pax Romana. In fact, Luke chapter 2 begins in the days of Caesar Augustus, and we know about Caesar. You can read about him. This is actually a statue. And by the way, a little interesting thing about this statue is that this was actually created when he was about 70 years old, and he's presented looking young. So even back then, 2,000 years ago, it's sort of like Instagram, you know, you want to make yourself look good. So Augustus Octavian portrayed himself in this statue looking like a young, buff guy, which really, at the time it was created, he was really an old guy. But we know a lot about his reign, and we can study about his reign, and we can see it all throughout the historical record. In fact, it actually, to be frank with you guys, it actually just it actually perplexes me how people can say that the New Testament is not reliable historically, because it is one of the most, it's grounded in one of the most well-attested historical periods in the ancient world, and that is during the Roman Empire, when they had the Peace of Rome, or the Pax Augustus, and there's extensive records. You've got Tacitus, you've got Josephus, you've got other writings, you've got archaeology, you have any number of writings that really show that this is a period in which we had got quite a lot of information about. And so he exercised great influence over the world of the New Testament. A couple other quick examples here. The Politarch inscription was found in Thessaloniki, Greece, mid-2nd century, mentions this particular word, and I'm probably going to slaughter the pronunciation here, but Politarchunton, which is a Greek technical word. It's the correct label of the authorities, as the city authorities, as politarchs, indicating that Luke, the gospel writer Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, he also wrote the book of Acts. He wrote this, and Acts actually mentions the name of Politarch. So whoever's writing Luke and Acts, they got it right, which means that they were a very good historical source. And here's an example of how the archaeology, in this case, this discovery of the Plutarch inscription, actually matches exactly what the New Testament says. So this is one of many. We don't have time to go over all of them. And perhaps on a latter webinar, we're going to cover New Testament archaeology in much more extensive detail. Another quick example is the Gallio inscription, found also in Greece, middle of the first century. It is the first extra biblical evidence of the existence of Gallio, which dates Paul's travels. We know specifically because of when Gallio reigned. His name is mentioned in Acts chapter 18, verses 12 through 17. So in fact, there's a really amazing book written some years ago by a Roman historian by the name of Colin Hemer. And that book is called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. It's an expensive book. So if you are a book nerd, let me warn you, it's about 60 or 70 bucks if you get it. I'm not sure, maybe its prices went up, but I had to save my pennies to get my copy. But in any case, Colin Hemer, the Roman historian, lists 84 historical details, geographical details that only an eyewitness would know. So we know that Luke, the gospel writer Luke, was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul in his missionary journeys, and he's recording very specific historical things that we can go and investigate by using archaeology. So let me jump ahead here, and I'm going to go through these slides, and I'm going to show this guy right here. There are other historical figures. The one that most people know about in the New Testament is Herod the Great. And when I say the great, I don't mean that he was a good guy. He wasn't. He was really a bad guy. What I mean is Herod the Great builder. He was a great builder, and he left behind really amazing buildings throughout Israel. And so he was actually from the time of the Hasmoneans, he was essentially an Idumean. He really wasn't a Jew. And I'm going to slide through these screens here because we don't have time. But he was first named as governor of Galilee at 25 years of age. The Hasmonean dynasty ended when Herod conquered Jerusalem with the help of the Romans. Herod was named king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 BC. And he built massive building projects. This is one of the many he built throughout Judea. This is Masada, of course. This is the northern hanging palace of Masada overlooking the Dead Sea. And this is yours truly, soaking up the rays in Herod's palace, waiting for someone to bring me some grapes and water because it was hot. No, but what's cool, I want to point out, the paint is actually original to the original structure. It's pretty amazing. These frescoed walls are 2,000 years old. And you can see there on the top of Masada, the storage grain bins that were Herod actually had built to withstand a siege. And then not only did Herod build these massive palace fortresses, he also built and expanded the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. We see there, this is actually a drawing from the architectural archaeologist, Dr. Lean Rittmeyer, who is a brilliant archaeologist of Jerusalem. And I would encourage folks, if you want to get a good book on the archaeology of Jerusalem, then go to Amazon and check out, it's called The Quest. The Quest by Lean, L-E-E-N, Rittmeyer. The Quest, check it out. It's the best book in the archaeology of Jerusalem in print, in my opinion. And this is from that book, a drawing from that book of what the Temple Mount very likely looked like during the time of Christ. Now, in the middle of the screen, you can see the crease in the book there. The thing that remains, you can actually see today, is something called Robinson's Arch. You can see there, this is the remains of the arch of the monumental staircase that would actually go up into the Temple Mount area in Jerusalem. One other thing I want to point out in this photograph is the stones at the base of this wall. These stones, they have a particular name. Archaeologists actually call these ashlar masonry. And these very large stones were actually pushed down during the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. If you remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, his disciples motioned to the temple and they said, Lord, look at this amazing building. And Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another, all will be cast down. So there are the stones that were cast down exactly as Jesus said that they would be. So let me back up before I get to the next slide, because it takes a little bit of explanation. And I know you may have questions, so hang tight. I'm going to get to it. It's a massive subject, and we are just scratching the tip of the iceberg tonight. But I wanted to give you some really good stuff here. But several years ago, there was an excavation done on the Haram el Sharif, the Temple Mount area, under the ground, and it was done illegally. And this excavation was being basically prepared for a mosque or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what the purpose of it was, but it was done illegally because digging under the Temple Mount is actually illegal. And the dirt was taken away and it was put in dump truck loads. And later, a graduate student of archaeology found out where the dump truck loads of dirt went and started something called the Temple Mount Sifting Project. And in fact, if you go to Jerusalem, you can actually take part as a volunteer to actually sift through. They wet sift through the dirt that was taken out from under the Temple Mount. So what that means contextually from archaeology is that whatever is discovered in this dirt, we know came from under the Temple Mount, which means that it came from the temple area. And just recently, an archaeologist put together these amazing tiles of marble, and this is known as opus sectile, which is actually the flooring of the temple, which was very, very elaborately decorated. And so this is what the temple floor would look like in the Temple Mount area, and these were discovered during the Temple Mount Sifting Project. Another thing that was discovered actually in a drainage ditch that came from the Temple Mount is this little golden bell. You see there the size of it, and I believe it was the Israeli archaeologist, Dr. Eli Shukran, who actually discovered this, if I'm not mistaken. And when he found it, he thought it was just a little dirt clod, and because it was covered with dirt, but he could kind of hear something shaking around in it. So he got water, he cleaned it off, and lo and behold, it is a bell, a golden bell. And we know from the Bible that the priest would actually attach bells around their garments. So this was found during the Temple Mount Sifting Project, and a remarkable discovery indeed, showing that the Temple Mount contained the temple in Jerusalem. This, of course, is the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, the remnants of the retaining wall that actually contained the temple. I'm going to end with this and then open up for Q&A for you guys. This is actually an aerial photograph of a palace fortress. Earlier, I showed you Masada, built by Herod the Great. This was also built by Herod. And this is a man-made, literally a man-made mountain that's a palace fortress called Herodium. And it was named in honor of himself. And according to Josephus, Herod was actually buried in Herodium. Years ago, there was an Israeli archaeologist, Dr. Ehud Netzer, and Dr. Netzer spent his entire life studying the building projects of Herod the Great. And interestingly, Dr. Netzer actually discovered just a few years ago the destroyed sarcophagus of Herod the Great. And there it is, discovered in 2009. And there he is kneeling beside the coffin. You say, well, why was it smashed up? Well, Herod had a lot of people that hated him, and so it's likely, potentially, even his own family did. But the fact of the matter is, based on the archaeology, the provenance, the context, this is very, very highly likely the coffin of Herod the Great, which we found at Herodium. Another thing that was recently discovered was just a couple of years ago at Herodium was the signet ring of Pontius Pilate. So again, archaeology affirms the Bible says there was a guy named Pilate. Josephus says there was a guy named Pilate that Jesus stood before. Tacitus said there's a guy named Pilate. The archaeologists found this ring in 1969 at Herodium, but it wasn't really deciphered until a couple of years ago. And it actually directly links Pontius Pilate to Herod Antipas. In Luke 23, we know Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, and very likely had some of his official business done at Herodium. This was discovered at Herodium, which is, by the way, 3 miles southeast of Bethlehem. which is where Jesus was born. So a little bit of irony there. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and see if you guys have any questions. So give me a second. Let me pull up my Facebook to see if you all have any questions. And so hang on one sec. Let me go to Epic Archaeology. If you have any questions, put them in the comment section, and we'll go for just a few more minutes for the Q&A. Hopefully this is still going live. So I can't really tell for sure. So give me 1 second here. You guys have any questions? All right. Very informative. Listening from Peru. Very good. So, all right. So does anybody have any questions out there in comments? If you don't, that's fine. Totally good. We're going to do this again next week. Same time, we're going to be talking about artifacts from the Oriental Institute Museum. So if you do have any questions, then please put them in the comment section. Thank you all for commenting. We have Jim Eford, great to see you, brother. And Ricardo Perez, thank you so much for that comment. And Nate Loper, Maria, thank you for listening from Lima, Peru. Hello to everyone in Peru. Thank you for watching, and anyone else watching as well. Yeah, if you have any questions, please put it in the comment section. But again, we are going to be doing this next week, Facebook Live, Zoom Live. So you can check the listings out. We're going to be posting them on Facebook Live, or actually, excuse me, on Facebook in the next couple of days, so you can have the information. So any resources or any suggestions, rather, for good sources on Egyptian chronology and how it relates to, great question, great question. Yes, this is a question from Fiona. Any good resource? So yes, a couple of things. I got two ideas for resources. One is an excellent book by an Old Testament scholar by the name of John Currid, C-U-R-R-I-D. And the name of the book is Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. Now, it's not necessarily getting into the chronology, but it is getting into the historical background and the illumination of the archaeology of ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. The other source, as it relates to the chronology of Egypt, and I will actually post these in the comment section. There's an article by Dr. Doug Petrovich, who is a language scholar, and he has done a really, really great article on the identity of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who we believe is Amenhotep II, based on the early dating of the Exodus. And then the other book that I'll recommend, I've got it right behind me here. It's an old copy. It's called Kingdom of Priests by Dr. Eugene Merrill. Kingdom of Priests. It is not only about the old. It's not only talks about the ancient Egypt. It also talks about the chronology of the entire Old Testament as it relates to other nations. So Assyria, Egypt, Babylon. It gives you the dates and why we believe these certain events happen. It really brings up an important question in biblical archaeology, and that is. I'm going to steal this from another archaeologist, Dr. Bill Deaver at the University of Arizona several years ago. He's retired now. He wrote a book, What Did the Biblical Writers Know and When Did They Know It? It's a great question because really that's the crux of the issue. The chronology is the backbone of history. There's also a really good article that I think is good that we wrote on Epic Archaeology called The Backbone of History. So it gets into chronology and why chronology is important, the dating is important. So, so Fiona, I hope I answered your question. I will be posting those links to those articles and books in the comment section on Facebook Live. So if you are watching this later on YouTube, you're gonna have to go to Epic Archaeology Facebook to see the links. But those are the resources for Egyptian history and how they relate to the Old Testament. All right, so let me, again, I'll put a plug in for next week. We're going to be talking about the archaeological artifacts from the Oriental Institute Museum. So it's going to be sort of like a virtual tour of the Oriental Institute. We're going to talk about the museum itself, the founding of the museum, and some of the main artifacts in the museum. It's really just a history of the Old Testament. I mean, so you're going to get to see some really, really good stuff. Let's see here. All right, so David asked the questions, if we're talking chronology, why do most standard texts say that Tutmosis III was the pharaoh in 1446 and not Amenhotep II? Great question, David. Again, I'm going to point you to the article by Doug Petrovich, and it has to do with the chronology of ancient Egypt, and specifically in the 18th dynasty. And so it's a little bit difficult to answer in a simple way here, but just suffice it to say that there is some really good historical evidences that Amenhotep II, his reign is around 1446. It's within the range of acceptability in scholarship, the range of the date of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep II. And not only that, when you look at the reign of Thutmose III and you look at his life, there's nothing in the reign of Thutmose III that actually indicates that there was any kind of mass exodus of a slave force in Egypt. But under the reign of Amenhotep II, you actually do. So again, I would point out the article by Doug Petrovich, Amenhotep II and the Exodus as the Exodus Pharaoh, which I'll be posting on the Facebook comment section. But the biblical reason why that's the case is 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says that 480 years after the Exodus, Solomon laid the foundations of his temple in Jerusalem. And that date in which most scholars place is about 966 to 967 BC. So when you do the math, 966, 967, and you do the 480 years, plus or minus, that puts you around 1446 BC. That also comports with the Jubilee cycles that's mentioned in Leviticus. If the priest began counting the year of Jubilee when they left the Exodus, then that would also confirm the early dating of the Exodus being 1446. We actually have a whole presentation on this, and we may perhaps do a future Zoom webinar on the some of the details, historical chronological details for that. But let me just say, with the Exodus and the conquest stand or fall together. And this is actually, I'm summarizing a quote here from actually James Hoffmeyer. You've got to look at both of them together. So Moses controversy, Ricardo says, what is your view on the archaeological materials in the documentary? I'm watching this Philippines. Ricardo, thank you for watching from the Philippines. I thought Patterns of Evidence was great. I actually did a review on it. So if you go to our YouTube channel, Epic Archaeology YouTube, there is a review of the first Patterns of Evidence. And of course, there's been more that's been created. But I think Tim Mahoney's done an excellent job of presenting material. It is a visually stunning documentary, a lot of great information. He presents both sides of the issue so that you can make your own mind up. For myself, I've studied this for over 20 years, and I'm convinced that the best evidence for the Exodus is in the early dating of the Exodus. And again, we can talk more about that later, but I would encourage you to check our video review of Patterns of Evidence. Also, check out our Monocle and Spade episode in which we interview Doug Petrovich, and we get into some of the details of that as well. All right, so we are just about out of time. I went a little bit over, trying to go a little bit over an hour, but so thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that this has been an encouragement to you and an edification of your faith. So thank you so much again for watching our first live Zoom webinar on Epic Archaeology. And again, we're going to be meeting next time, 7 o'clock. We're going to be putting this on Facebook, or on this will be on Facebook, but we're also going to put this on YouTube as well. So please, if you want to share this with your friends on YouTube, you can do that as well. Again, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a great night. And if you have any questions, put them in the comment section, and I'll try to get to them as soon as I possibly can. Thank you so much, guys.